Warm welcome to the People Matters virtual session. Today, I'm Esther Martinez. I'm the CEO and Editor-in-Chief at People Matters, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to this exciting session, and I'm going to be the host for you today. I would like to thank each one of you who's taking time to join us for this conversation, and the topic we've chosen is really about this next curve when we're talking about defining hybrid workplace. And I think there is, as you have sensed, there is a sense of urgency to find a way to go back to whatever we call this normal. And I think there is no one solution and there is no one best practice. And I think the only way we can look at it is really as emerging practices and taking one step on what's next after the different series of lockdowns that we're going through, and really navigating the solutions that we need to support our business, to deliver in the marketplace and support our customers to really have access to our products and services. So today what we're going to be discussing is a little bit of a reflection about what is this new normal? What are some of the policies that really take importance and priority when it comes to defining this hybrid workplace? What are some of the elements of managing performance and measuring performance? And what is it that we need to do as HR professionals to be able to accelerate business impact? And I'm going to be inviting our panelists in a minute, but before I do that, just sharing a little bit about People Matters for some of you who may be new in our community. So we have over 350,000 users around the world, and we are the fastest growing digital community focused in the space of people and work. We also launched the BNext platform. Many of you had the opportunity to be part of our learning platform. We've certified over 4,000 learners in the last 9 months on critical skills like agile, talent analytics, digital change management, and employee experience as well. So without further ado, let's get started with the conversation today. And I have the privilege to introduce our speakers. We have Aaron McEwen, Vice President, Research and Advisory at Gartner, joining us. Hi, Aaron. A very warm welcome and good afternoon.
Yeah, hi. I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining. Joining Aaron as well, we have Michael Chetner, Head of Australia and New Zealand for Zoom. Hi, Michael. Very good afternoon to us as well.
Hi, Esther. Look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining. And joining, we have as well Steve Reed, founder, Culture Eats Strategy, and ex-CHRO for O Media. Warm welcome, Steve. How are you today?
Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Great to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for taking your time to be with us. I think our objective is to find answers to some of the challenges that you're all facing. And as you see on your screen, you'll have an opportunity to also send questions on the chat. We're going to be taking questions as we go through the conversation. So feel free to bring your dilemmas and your challenges, and we'll try our best to bring some perspectives. I'm not sure if we can find answers for all of those challenges, but at least really bring some of those perspectives and insights that the diversity of this group brings to the fore. So let me start with the first question to the three of you, really about when you're looking at the context, the business context today, and the challenges that we face as talent leaders. If I were to invite you to just pick up one of those that you think is the number one challenge that you hear business and HR leaders keeping themselves awake at night, what would that one number big challenge be for you? Anybody who wants to start? We'll kind of compile those top of the mind key challenges that you think are most critical. Michael, you want to start? Or Steve?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
go ahead.
Business point of view, I think certainly it's that, what does this new normal look like, and how we're going to maximize our ability to work in a way which is different for everybody but suits everybody. And for me personally, I think the big challenge that comes out of that as we move to a more hybrid world is the challenge of connection. And how do we keep people connected both to each other, to teams, to other teams, but also to the organization itself as we work in a more hybrid way, and what are the ways we can effectively do that?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. So being connected beyond just the technology side, but it's really about feeling connected. You think it's your number one challenge. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go next. really it's the uncertainty. The uncertainty 15 months ago is changed in context for the uncertainty going forward. And I think we do need to understand that every country, every state across the world have their own context around that. But at the end of the day, we have this cloud of uncertainty. So what do we do with it? And how do we build resilience and flexibility around that going forward?
Wonderful. I love that, Michael, because I think as we go through these milestones, and we were just discussing before we went live, that you're kind of looking at almost like one closer milestone at a time, because it's very difficult to plan anything beyond maybe the next 1 or 2 months or 3 months. So that resilience to be able to keep energy up, even considering you can't plan ahead, is, you think, the number one challenge for talent leaders.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Aaron, what would yours be?
Well, I'm going to answer it a little bit differently because I'm not sure that executives are losing sleep enough over what I'm about to say, and maybe they should be. And that is that, all of our data that we've collected here at Gartner would suggest that most executives are looking at the end of this year and the first half of next year as a return to growth. And a return to quite aggressive growth targets. So, double digits at a minimum. And I think whilst we might be out of the worst of the pandemic and that looks potentially promising, and we might see a return to favorable economic conditions, I think the reality is that many of these leaders will face having a workforce that is depleted, fatigued, very stressed out and almost damaged, I think is probably the best way to put it. And so where is that growth going to come from? We know the importance of talent management and the importance of talent in driving growth, particularly through discretionary effort. So I really worry that we might be trying to grow from a very difficult base and position to grow from.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aaron. And what I'm hearing you say is that the challenge is not so much about whether the potential from economic perspective is there, but whether we going to have the resilience, to Michael's point, the base to be able to capture that opportunity in terms of our ability to just increase. Anushri, any concerns? No? All right. Okay, no problem. So what I'm hearing you say, Arun, is that it's not so much about whether the opportunity from an economic perspective is there or not, but whether we have the energy, the talent energy to be able to capture that opportunity from productivity and innovation perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly as it's very likely that borders will remain closed. So access to, relatively cheap talent or other sources of talent, those will be likely to be restricted for some time to come. So essentially, we have the workforce that we've got right now, and that workforce is not faring particularly well right now. And so there's a lot of work that I think we as talent leaders need to do to make sure that we are both creating the capacity for that growth, but also positioning our assets so that they're doing the most valuable things and not being caught up in the things that add less value.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm gonna double click on these 3 challenges that you mentioned, and I can see many of you joining us from different parts in the region. And thank you so much for joining. And make sure that you do use the chat to let us know what you want us to cover more, because we are really at your service today. So Michael, I'm going to invite you to double click a little bit. And we talked about, Steve talked about the need to be connected or to feel connected. And you spoke about the ability to be resilient and to really tap into that energy and discretionary effort, which is really connected to our own challenge as well. So what are some of the policies, or what are some of the priorities that you think we should focus on to be able to tackle these multiple challenges and really at the end of the day to enable every individual to fulfill its potential to create impact to the organization?
Yeah, there's a few, and as much as Zoom has been involved in connecting people during this pandemic, I mean, we've gone through a lot of these changes ourselves as we've grown the business. So some of my examples are, I guess, observations from a personal level, but also in terms of actually what we lived through. But how to build teams. What's the policy around building teams that predominantly are now going to involve individuals that won't step into a physical space. They will need to work as part of a hybrid workforce. So having some thought around how to onboard and how to, talk about Aaron's concept about connection, or whether Steve mentioned it, that's critical. How do you create that? I mean, when the teams that we had, we worked with in the past, were able to physically work together as teams, but that level of trust perhaps can't be manufactured unless we start working on policies on how do we actually improve that level of connection to drive that type of trust. I think from a Zoom perspective, we imparted so much trust on our employees, but a lot of that was because of a strong culture that already existed. So back to my point, around those talent policies around onboarding new talent, building teams and growing. Aaron talked about how the levels of growth are going to come in the future years with the same workforce. Well, then, there's only so much that can go around. And ultimately, and something that we've done a lot is, how do we actually transform how we sell? As crazy as it sounds, I mean, we haven't been selling over video all the time. If anything, we've unshackled the ability to now use tools such as Zoom to be able to continue what we do during the pandemic over this communication technology. So how can we sustain that going forward? And I guess ultimately, for anything that we've seen is we've smashed a lot of these limiting beliefs. So how do we actually make sure we embrace that transformation and not lose the moment to push forward with a lot of things that we've been able to break in terms of perceptions and turn into reality. So just to summarize that, the policies around talent, the transformation, not only internally, but also how people do their jobs to sell and to develop their workforce, and ultimately the trust that surrounds that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michael. And please, Steve and Arun, feel free to add to each other's point as well as we go along. But Michael, interested to invite you to reflect a little bit more about what you mentioned, that we shouldn't lose the opportunity that we are right now on having broken some of those myths and beliefs of how do you build culture and how do you build trust beyond a physical environment. And I think different organizations have different philosophies, but there is a segment of organizations that are in a hurry to probably go back to the physical space, go back to whatever that normal looks like. And what I hear you say, it may be an opportunity loss because we now have a larger scope to be able to look at work differently.
Yeah, well, I think it gets down to, the office, the office, as we call it, is just another place to work. I mean, as much as I'm here at home, or we do have an office for certain reasons, like showcasing solutions to customers, that doesn't need to, be a permanent abode for workers in the future. Just like we're seeing a lot of migration of movement, certainly in Australia, into regional areas. So ultimately, that if we are basing policies around a physical presence or a physical place or a central place, that needs to be challenged. And when we talk about connection or having access to, certainly from a technology perspective, access to tools that you can do that job effectively, regardless of location. I mean, that then is the first element of how to maintain a new form of connection, that Steve mentioned before. Yeah. But one of the challenges that we're seeing with customers is it's interesting because you start flipping this model where we're all sitting here as four squares in a very democratic fashion with no titles. Nothing is really challenging the ability for us to say something as we want to. So if I'm back in an office, if you think about if I'm back in my physical office and I'm sitting around a conference room, that level of equality goes away because now I've got four people sitting around a table in a completely different format to what we're now used to. So we are thinking from a technology side of things, how do we actually solve that in terms of framing people and being able to use that AI to be able to frame people in a conference room to reflect this look and feel that we've been used to for the last 18 months. But regardless of technology, I think we just that equity of access, making sure that physical space is not something that is required for you to maintain, credibility or criteria for promotions. And again, I don't think we have the answers to it, but what we do know is a change in terms of how we create and maintain those policies for leadership going forward. Managing people is one of those aspects. And communicating has overtaken all sorts of physical requirement in terms of that management that we would have had in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And I'm going to invite Arun to comment on it in a minute, on how does that impact the way we look at performance and the way we look at really managing talent. But before I do that, Steve, I'd love to invite you to comment on this whole balance. And I think Arun was reflecting about it when we say that, what's happening really to our teams and our talent, and how working from home has been a great opportunity to break many myths, but it's also been a challenge for many of us to really create a differentiation between work and personal life. And that really, going back to what Arun was saying, of a depleting energy level and fatigue that really creeps in. So what are some of the opportunities that you think we have to manage those work arrangements? What are some of the things that are emerging as, I don't want to call it best practices, because there is no best practices, but what have you seen organizations doing to be able to manage that balance between what the business need and what we need as individuals as well?
Yeah, it's an awesome point. I think, harking back to what Michael was talking about, the trust bit, I think there's got to be this basis of trust that kind of comes through now in the relationship between leaders and their teams. And, I think even your first question is, I think there are mixed expectations of leaders and general workers as to what the new normal looks like and what going back to normal kind of might look like, and very different. So I think, it starts with getting some very clear expectations on the table around, what are we expecting, what are we seeing, and then challenging some of the things that may be old world models, old world thinking, or just perception based. We know that, history and research tells us that people will favour people that they're in proximity to, right? So if they're working in an office with someone as opposed to someone who's more or less virtual all the time, we've got to be careful that that doesn't flow through into all kinds of, judgments, etc. So it's challenging some of those old paradigms of how we thought. But the trust piece is a really important part of that. And I think the way that we'll start to overcome it is leaders being more purposeful and deliberate in terms of planning, work, and not just what work is done when, and, being flexible within employees and team members. It's also planning, if it's hybrid and we do have opportunities to be face-to-face, what work are we doing then? Because if you've got someone coming to an office, sitting at a desk for 8 hours, and just kind of doing solo work, that could be doing that, remotely. That's not going to change much, but it's looking for the opportunities to do things that are more difficult in a virtual world, which is, some of that brainstorming stuff, or certainly what I've noticed, cross-functional teamwork, which, and we've all been there. You've gone from one virtual meeting to another virtual meeting. There's not the level of chit chat. When you're exiting the room, you might talk about stuff. It's all those kind of opportunities, the water cooler moments and all that. So how do we make sure when people do have face-to-face time or time in an office, that it's doing work which lends itself, the office environment lends itself to, and then when they're not, they can focus on that kind of work. So I think it's going to be a much more deliberate planning of how work gets done. I did mention connection, and I think connection and well-being are very much related in terms of, how that works. And, people will need to feel in the new hybrid world that they're contributing, that what they do matters, and that they're being, recognised and rewarded for it. But I think this sense of belonging that comes from connection is important as well, and that can still be done in a virtual world. But again, it's being deliberate around how do we help create connection and belonging in that kind of world. And in my world, and in my mind, being religious about connection is how do we make sure we create those connection points for people, so that they do get the opportunity to do that. And that might mean rethinking how we run meetings to make sure that we create, that social connection space within the meeting time frame, for example, because most people are running from one-to-one back-to-back, and, unless you're joining the meeting room virtually 5 minutes early and it's open and you get a chance to chat before it starts, like, you don't have those. So it's really making sure we do those deliberately. And then you talked, I think, earlier about employee experience. And I think for me, it's about making sure that whatever choices people make, they have the chance to have a very similar experience. So if someone says, well, I'm actually going to be working out of my house today, I'm working off my mobile phone to call the calls, you get a different experience on your phone versus your laptop or a desktop in terms of interaction you may have. So how do we make sure we give people the same kind of options? And when I talk about consistent experiences, it's everything from, if you've got a hybrid meeting, is we're quite used to now virtually raising our hand. We're on a Zoom call to say, I want to ask a question. Maybe we then implement things like making sure that people in the room also are raising their hand to ask questions. So you have a unified experience, and it's the same for everybody. Because again, we've seen people in a room talking and someone's raised their hands, and 5 minutes later someone goes, oh, Aaron's got his hand raised. And so then Aaron comes on and says something, everyone goes, oh, that was so 5 minutes ago. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, well, because the conversation's moved on. So how do we make sure the experience allows it to be a more live conversation? And then lastly, I think you talked about balance and workloads. And I think that really comes down to the discipline of people to say, I know how I'm balancing my day, but I know when I'm on, I know when I'm off, and I'm being religious and sticking to that as well, and having very strong boundaries around it, because it is easy to blend it all and assume if I take an hour off to spend with the kids doing schoolwork, because we're in lockdown homeschooling, that we can make it up at the end of the day. But it's actually being very religious about when and how we do that, and making sure it's actually not impacting on our ability to take time for ourselves in that as well. So I think my point is everything's going to be more deliberate and more purposeful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. And I think your concluding part about being intentional, and I think intentional at all levels, right? From a leadership perspective, from an organizational expectation perspective, but even as an individual, being intentional about, where are my boundaries and how I'm contributing, but also how I'm taking time to be able to re-energize myself. So Arun, I'm coming to you because as I'm hearing Michael and Steve, there are multiple things on the table as potential solutions. But it really worried me, your starting comment to say, well, we're just not aware how grave the situation is in terms of, the level of energy that we have in our teams. And we may have a fantastic culture, like Michael was saying in Zoom, or we may have great intentional leaders that are really trying to build empathy. But the reality is that how do we solve for, the 18 months of fatigue? And whether that's, what are the ways that we can solve that? Before we get into maybe the point about performance and how do we measure performance, I would love to invite you to comment on what could be the potential solutions for that depleting energy levels on our workforce.
Extending from what Steve said, I think all of the solutions need to be holistic and interconnected. So I don't think there is one single solution to this problem. But when I kind of look at what are the big things that we could tackle, one Steve has already mentioned, which is well-being. We have to have very deliberate and holistic well-being strategies, and not just the extension of benefits like, meditation or yoga or mindfulness training or resilience programs. They're added on. What we really need to look at is how the work is designed. How we create the disciplines that Steve was talking about around when work begins, when it ends, when we have breaks. And I think a really big chunk of this, and this is a very sobering discussion that I think executives need to tackle head on, it's a resourcing issue. Fatigue is caused because our employees are overworked. They have too much to do and not enough time to do it. And they're trying to do that now in the midst of a major pandemic. They're trying to homeschool their children. Life is a lot more complex. And there is no indication that life is going to get any less complex or that the world is going to get any less disruptive. So I think for me, it's like, wellbeing programs need to be central to this. The way that we manage performance, which I can get to, needs to be central to this.
Yeah.
The way that we design our organizations, our structures, our resourcing, our teams, our budgets. I think the days of hyper efficiency running on a margin, on the smell of an oily rag, as we say in Australia, or where we, on a regular basis, do restructures that cut deeply into muscle. Those days are gone, because what we've realized during the pandemic is that a lean supply chain can be completely disrupted by the loss of 1 or 2 or 3 key people. And we just can't afford that in a world that we don't know where the next pandemic is going to come from, or whatever that version is, whether it's a Cold War in China or whatever other geopolitical challenge might come our way. So I think we have to be really purposeful about how we resource our teams. And there's a couple of ways you can tackle that. One is you can add resources, but you can also just get rid of things. And I would argue that everybody's job is full of stuff that we don't need to do, that chews up our time. Reporting on what we've done, which is a great segue to the performance management stuff. Yeah. How many of us are managing our employees, if I can be so bold to say, in a lazy way. We ask our employees to provide an update on what they've delivered to us. That's just wasting their time. So either we invest in technology that tracks that stuff so that they don't have to do it, or we just measure their outputs. We measure their contributions. We measure the value that they delivered, and how they get there probably doesn't matter. So if they choose to do that at night when their kids are in bed and they get those things done, that should be fine. If they choose to come into an office and do a 9-to-5 model, and that's the way that they work best, that's fine as well. But what we shouldn't be doing is judging and measuring our employees on how much time they spend in front of their computers. And that's a lazy way of measuring. So I don't think we need to change best practice performance management in any way. We've always known that managing by inputs is bad performance management. Now we just have to do good stuff because we can't afford to run it that way. It's simply not going to work anymore. So for me, that's really the secret is, and there's another kind of layer that I think is important for this. The future of work is going to be the work that can't be automated. So that by definition is more complex, it's more relational, it's more creative, it's more problem-solving focused, and it involves a lot of soft, what we've traditionally called soft skills. All of that repeatable administration stuff, that's what's going to be automated. Unfortunately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to run our businesses and our people as though they are 20th century factory workers, through inputs and controls and consistent environments and all of these types of methods. The knowledge work in particular of the future is going to be a lot more complex, and it's going to be delivered by human beings, complex human beings. So we need to create a more human-centric model of work. And I think the secret to that is, and we're already seeing the early signs of the development of a science around human flourishing. What is the ultimate performance output of a human? And how do we create the conditions that best facilitate or contribute to that? And there's one thing I know is that offices in their current environments do not produce well-rounded, healthy, high productivity employees. And partly the lesson that we learned during COVID is that when people have more autonomy of creating their own work environment, all of a sudden productivity goes up, quality goes up. The only problem, and this is a big one, is that we haven't yet taught our employees how to create the disciplines to protect their health. So the biggest risk is that if we keep going, they will just keep working harder and harder and harder, and eventually they'll fall over and collapse, much like an athlete who doesn't manage their performance as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aaron, for sharing that. And I'll invite Steve and Michael to comment on this performance and the way we look at setting expectation, and Steve, you were mentioning about that, saying that setting expectations is an important input for trust and culture and connection, and also feeling that I'm in control and I'm contributing. And Michael, you were talking about how we deliver that work needs to be different. How do you look at this performance, and not necessarily performance management process and system, but really philosophically? What is performance, and how do we measure performance? I think it's a very important component of this intentional design of work. What will be your reflection, Steve and Michael?
I think there are several, and Erin made some incredible points there. So I think for me, thinking about it, it is about, as we said, that intention piece. But also from a performance point of view, I think, looking at outputs and outcomes and that kind of thing clearly is important, rather than just, as Aaron said, the time you spent in front of a computer, etc. I think at an individual level, as Aaron said, we've seen productivity increase with a lot more virtual working, home working. There is, some of the stuff which I know way back, Aaron will know about the network performance, within organisations, etc. So it's the big challenge for me is how do we start to measure, is the performance at a network level, the performance we're gaining across the teams, how are we measuring that, how are we tying into that, and how are we setting the right expectations around what that looks like, and how we best facilitate it. But I think it comes back to this point, is that if you start with the intent and the view that, everyone is trying to do the best job they can, and everyone should be trusted to do that job in the way they see fit, until you have clear data points and proof or evidence of otherwise, then you start on the right foot. And I think if you're starting from the basis that people need to be monitored and, checked in on and micromanaged, and that, as Aaron said, you'll waste a whole lot of time doing stuff which actually takes away from their ability to perform and their ability to get balance. And I think they're the things is where we can automate, things that actually check on what's being delivered, and allow people to get focused on actually planning and delivering, then we'll be better.
Yeah, just some of those. We had a real life an opportunity to observe some of our customers who are going through this immediate transformation that were required, to literally flip to a hybrid model overnight without knowing that. And I think anecdotally, and these are my observations, is those organizations that were already ready with and had that type of trust in employees. And trust is we can't define that with specifics here, but when the culture is right, and that trust for employees to do the right thing, and the opportunity arises like we had literally overnight, that acceleration was quite noticeable with a number of those organizations. So what happens, when you start looking at results 15, 18 months down the line, those metrics around financial performance and all the ways that companies are measured in traditional ways have a meaningful difference, right? If it's increased profitability, increased share price, whatever it is. The point being is that there is a very clear difference between those organizations who are ready to go and those that were catching up. So when we look at the other side is, we see some traditional industries who we have to, I guess, unwind some of those limiting beliefs. They struggle. However, the good thing is, because of unfortunately as well, because of the sustained pandemic, it gave an opportunity. If you wanted to make the change, you would make it. And then you have the laggards, and the laggards are going to exist in any maturity curve, as we know. But what will be really clear, especially from an employee perspective, is that if I've got company A here that I can start seeing meaningful differences in how they perform, the perception of their brand, their social status and so forth, versus another laggard option within that same industry, that decision has already been made by that potential employee. So I think the worry is more around if you don't know what you don't know around this as well. That probably reflects also, your culture. It goes back to then the culture. Then those types of things are, again, very difficult to define. But you see the net results after that period of time of what the impact of having a poor culture is. So there's a lot of learnings on it. I think the case studies that will come out of what went right and what went wrong is already starting to trickle out. But again, as I referred at the start, is that when in my example and the example from our CEO down, when that trust is given to you that you are going to do the right thing, and the employees know that they have that trust, you'll be amazed to see how much they can run with that and repay you. But to Aaron's point, it's only a certain amount of capacity and resource left there. And I think as I look at it, or as we look at it for our teams, that's the next challenge, is we can have that culture, we can have that trust bestowed. I think the other concern is also companies are now saying, well, we trust you to go and do this. Now, actually, we trust us to do the right thing as well. Should you go back to the office? So we've got to be careful on that as well, I think. And for an employee front too, that trust was provided, and that trust needs to be reciprocated. That, you know, if the company culture was good for you to have that individual accountability and responsibility, we also need to understand that from a leadership perspective, that will reflect back in terms of how leaders need to lead. And it'll be interesting to see, is that leadership going to sustain in those great examples that we've seen, and is it just going to make it worse where those examples are not so good? So, I mean, trust trumps a lot of this, but trying to get to that point with a culture is probably the $1 million question that any company wants to get to.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michael, for sharing that. And I'm tempted to invite you to tell us, what are some of those elements of trust that we can think about, or the dimensions of trust. But before I do that, there's a question specifically on how do we avoid burnout. And Arun, you were mentioning that before, saying that it is really about resource allocation, and you spoke about things that we need to stop doing to create more capacity. And again, going back to Michael's point, that probably will have to be an individual and a team exercise, and putting the customer and the marketplace at the center. How do we facilitate those conversations to build more capacity and to reallocate work? Because that can't happen top down. I mean, going back to trust and decentralizing those decisions. So how could organizations look at that?
Well, this is kind of one of those things where we can't trust our employees. and what I mean by this is what the pandemic has shown us is that if you give your employees autonomy and a sense of purpose and clear direction, they go and work, and they work and work and work and work if we let them. So ironically, I think that one of the things we have to do here is not trust that employees will take care of themselves. And we might have to step in. And I spent a lot of my early life working in very industrial and blue collar settings. So I've worked in everything from abattoirs and farms, shearing sheds, construction sites. And there's a common thread through those environments. And that is that you don't start until start time. You take what we call in Australia a smoko break, which is your morning tea, and you take it religiously, and you have your lunch, and then you finish the day. So I actually think as the world moves into this, hybrid virtual 24-hour cycle, we might have to bring back some good old-fashioned start when you start, finish when you finish, and have good breaks. And to me, that's going to be the role of managers and leaders as we transition into the hybrid world. Your job is less about telling your employees what to do and much more about setting clear expectations and a clear sense of purpose, and then stepping in to tell them when to stop.
Interesting.
Now it's time to stop. Go on holiday, take your leave. Those will be critical skills for leaders, and that does require empathy. And sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. No, I love that, because Arun, is very provocative what you're mentioning, that our role is to actually help people manage, their time and support them to say, well, now you're taking a break and it's mandatory that you take leave, which is, so different from what we have been encouraged to do, right?
And
so
the reason I say that is that we have to think of our employees more like an athlete or an artist, right? And so if you're a good athlete, you've got a coach, but you also have a team. And sometimes their job is to make sure that you do your appropriate exercise and push you and motivate you to do harder. but sometimes their job is to protect you from yourself, to ensure that you recover, that you don't, go into that extra race and injure yourself because you haven't prepared well. That, to me, that's the mindset of leaders in the 21st century. They have assets that they need to manage and take care of and ensure that those assets have the resilience and the power to do what they need to do, and to do it at the absolute highest level.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Arun. Steve, Michael, any comments?
Well, we just came out of I would say, a mandatory 1 day off on Monday for the whole business. Now, to your point, Aaron, sometimes that we were reluctant to take days off because of, whatever perceptions there are from a management level, or that you're not pulling your weight, especially in this current time.
Yeah.
And based upon that, the fact that it was mandated and mandated, I don't mean in a negative sense. I mean that our CEO made it very clear that the company is stopping operations for the day. And so that was clearly directed that way. And to your point, it's around an example of, well, sometimes to my point before, you need to trust that the leadership is going to do the right thing by you as well, and they need to pull through on that. And again, it is quite tactical. 1 day off is not going to solve everything, but we also had it was a great way to level everyone, number one, and also we provided guidance on how you should use that time. And literally, it's very simple. You just do not open the laptop, do not check your phone. And so it just forces you in that situation. So you need to know what that, I strongly agree on that. As much as that trust then is given, then at some point we need to reciprocate that from a leadership level to manage that way too, because we're not expendable. And unfortunately, in that world where you say robots can't replace humans in that creative thinking, we need to be healthy, we need to be sustainable, and it's not a never-ending. We need the support and guidance to be well looked after like an athlete. I think that's a great analogy, Aaron.
I love that you mandated a whole company day off. So this is really important. You can give people a day off, but there's this body of research that shows that you spend the entire day worrying about the pile of emails that you're going to come back to, and worrying about whether you're letting your colleagues down when you're not there. So by taking a whole company day off, I think that's actually one of the only ways to solve for that fatigue issue.
And you know what happened? The sky didn't fall in, and it was all fine. But that's a very simple realization that the world doesn't revolve around us individually or around the company. But yeah, it was very meaningful in that sense that we proved it, and the next one's in September. So we're also we've had a practice run, and it continues on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Fascinating,
Michael,
I think,
for sharing. Steve, you wanted to add something? I can see many comments from our listeners saying that it's great to. Yeah, go ahead, please.
It's certainly a novel concept that Aaron raises around us forcing people to not. And you have to think about, I guess, when people are working in an office, there are very visible signs of when people start work, when they leave, when the boss goes for a long lunch, etc. When you're working from home, you don't have those, and so my suspicion is part of this always on and desire to keep working is partly driven from a commitment and loyalty and wanting to be contributing, but also partly sometimes driven by fear, as you said, of what am I not doing or missing out on, or what's the expectation on me if it's not clear. And so I think the things like the all company day off are as much functional as they are a symbol of what's important. So I think the things that we do as leaders in companies need to send a very strong symbol that your well-being and time out is important. And if they simply have a day off, but then during that day off, you get 3 or 4 phone calls from your leader, like symbolically, it says that we don't really mean it, right? You've got a day off, but we actually expect you to be working. So I think it's important to think about the symbolic value of what we do as well and make sure it's real. So.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, Steve. And I think you're absolutely right, because I think the temptation would be to say, oh, let's just, set up a tactical day off just to follow the trend. But the intent that Arun and Michael were referring to is really about, are we signaling to those athletes that, you need to take care of yourself, and you can't, we need you for the long run. This is not a sprint, but it's really a marathon, and we need all of us to stay healthy and fit. So I'm conscious about time, and thanks all of you. And I think as I see the chat, and we've covered a lot of things that you were mentioning, I would like to invite our panelists to help us as a concluding comment. What will be your advice when you're looking at our listeners today, saying, redesigning that future of hybrid? And we spoke about trust, we spoke about managing expectations, we spoke about biases that creep in when you have different people working in different work environments. We spoke a lot about helping our employees to recover, to be ready for all the different races that we have. But if you were to invite us to reflect about one thing to stop, one thing to start, as we're looking at all these different initiatives, what will be your word of advice for us as HR leaders helping the organization to reinvent the way of work? What will be your advice of one thing to start, one thing to stop?
I would say stop restructuring, right? Stop trying to rebuild the structure to create additional efficiencies, and start following Marie Kondo. So just look at your business and ask yourself the question, does this thing add value? Does it bring joy? And if the answer to those two questions is no, just stop doing it and get rid of it and create more capacity. And if your employees have capacity, they will have joy. We like work, mostly. It's not all, it's not all great, but generally human beings like working. They just don't like working under extreme conditions and expectations. Wonderful. Capacity will just bring amazing things to organizations.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Arun. Steve, what would be your one thing to start, one thing to stop?
Yeah, I think my one thing to stop would be stop applying a one size fits all to it, and think that there's one solution for everything. There's multiple. And my start then is, start listening, checking in and acting on real-time feedback and real-time data, not just perceptions of what you think may be happening.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Michael?
Yeah, I guess, there's a couple of things to start, and they're probably more generic in the sense of what I've learned is, having an open mind that you're not going to come up with a solution on anything that we're getting faced at the moment. So for those organizations to take some risks, there's the risk appetite globally is gone up, not in the sense that we're doing more risky things, but the fact that we know we've gone through such a period of change and uncertainty, and the ability to try new things are there. And I would challenge that, any leader that can pick up something that they haven't been doing, whether it's micromanagement, whether it's the reporting, what happens if you stop reporting on things? I mean, Aaron, to your point, and it makes it easier if you can objectively see the output of a team, whether it's public information or whether it's your sales figures. I mean, everyone knows how to get to that point, but you don't necessarily need to have that, consistent reporting. So I think so all to the same theme as Aaron, those unnecessary things, that could be one of those things that you stop doing as well. Let's see what happens. As said on that example I had on Monday, I mean, nothing really changed. Not to dismiss the point that there's we've got to keep the business moving, but it was a risk that was taken. And it's paid off, and I think we have everyone aligned around what spending good quality time that's mandated by the company has been.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much, Michael, Steve, Arun. I think the closing of Michael, your point about taking risks, experiment more, connects back to the trust that people will do the right thing. Connects back to your capacity, Arun, about let go of things that are not adding business impact and not adding joy. I think I love your point about the element of joy as well. And Steve, your point about no one size fits all, connect back to the experimentation and using business data and not reporting to be able to know what are the right things that we need to focus on. So great conversation. I want to again thank you guys for spending time with us and give us that insight and a new way of thinking about those challenges. And I personally found it very fascinating, and I can see all the chat comments as well. And really, thank you very much for spending time with us and give us your reflections and insights. So thank you, Steve, Arun, and Michael, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. So thank you, everyone, as well, who join us, and we look forward to connecting with you very soon. A couple of small announcements. We have a study that we have launched only for the region, the Australian, New Zealand region. So requesting the team to put on the chat, the link for everyone to participate, and inviting you as well to join us at the People Matters Employee Experience APAC event, which is going to be on 9th of September. And I'm going to invite the team as well to send the request for all of you to register if you're interested in joining us for that event, which is going to be again in the Australia and New Zealand time zone. So that's all from our side for now, and wishing you a wonderful late afternoon, and stay safe. Thank you very much, everyone.